Canada's prison watchdog released some sobering statistics today about the use of solitary confinement in federal penitentiaries. Howard Sapers found a jump in the number of inmates being held in isolation, a practice human rights groups have either warned against or warns to, or that it leads to or exacerbates mental health problems. Let me show you some of the highlights from the Correctional Investigators report just out today. There have been an increase of more than 9% in the use of segregation in the last decade. There's a disproportionately high use of segregation for women, mentally ill people, Aboriginals, and especially black offenders. Nearly half of all inmates have spent some time in solitary, half. One positive trend, Sapers found the average length of stay in segregation is down from 27 days, can you imagine, from 40 days. Is Canada bucking the international trends of using solitary confinement too frequently? What impact does the practice have on inmates and on the institutions? Joining me now, the Correctional Investigator of Canada, Howard Sapers. Good to have you back, sir.
Hi.
You've been tracking the annual trends on the use of segregation in prison year by year for the last decade. What have you found?
Well, segregation use is going up. It's been going up steadily for every year, actually for the last 20 years. Today we presented a picture of the last 10, and it's gone up. And it's gone up a little bit in parallel with the overall population. In terms of individual placements, though, it's even been a more dramatic increase. So what I mean by that is the number of offenders that are going up, but also the number of placements. So some offenders being placed in segregation several times during a reporting year.
So you got prison populations from 2005 to 2015 increased by from 13.6% to 13.6%, but an increase in segregation of 9.2%.
Yeah, over that same period, and it also depends on what your cutoffs are. Last year, that figure would have been 15% instead of 9%. So we're seeing a little decrease in the proportion. Right. But overall, what we found, and this is the one thing that I found very striking in this snapshot, is that if you look at the current incarcerated population, it's about 15,000 men and women.
Right.
48%, nearly half of those individuals have experienced a placement in segregation during their sentence.
So it's used more. Why is that? Tell me why this is going up.
Well, it's a population management tool. It's
right.
supposed to be used sparingly. It's supposed to be an intervention that's guided by the law. And what we're seeing is that it's being used in response to a whole range of behaviors that I don't believe were originally intended when the framework was put into place. So segregation is sometimes an easy answer to a difficult problem. What
is worrisome? You talk about what's worrisome about who's getting in segregation, mentally ill, Aboriginal, black offenders, women. What worries you about when you drill down into the use of segregation?
Well, actually, that list of subpopulations inside our penitentiaries is what worries me. Not only is segregation use going up, but that increase in use is landing disproportionately on some people. Mentally ill women are segregated more than others. Aboriginal offenders are not only segregated more than others, they also continue to have the experience of the longest placements in segregation. And the use of segregation for black inmates has actually doubled over the 10 years.
Okay, now what you're raising there has turned into a very serious controversy. In January, the British Columbia Civil Liberties Union Association filed a lawsuit claiming the government was violating the Charter of Rights and Freedom using solitary confinement disproportionately with these exact groups that Mr. Sapers is just flagging here, mentally ill Aboriginal inmates. We had a chance to speak with Laura Track of the BCCLA. Here's what she told us. Canadian prisons are becoming de facto psychiatric institutions filled with people suffering from mental illness but ill-equipped to give them the treatment they need. Segregation is being used as a treatment option. It's where people are placed that the prison doesn't have the capacity or resources to support. Is that accurate, or are they targeted for other reasons?
We have found that there's an increase in the proportion of people who have a known mental illness inside segregation cells. And we also know that segregation placement itself is emerging as a risk factor for self-injury and even for suicide.
What does that mean? Just tell me that.
When we studied the last 30 suicides that occurred inside federal penitentiaries, nearly 50%, 14 of the 30 took place in a segregation cell. And so there's a correlation of people with mental health history or a history of self-injury or a history of suicide attempt who are placed in segregation.
And boy, that resonates with some pretty infamous cases.
Well, sure, and I think we know them. You know, Ashley Smith, Edward
That's right.
Snowshoe, sure.
Tell me about the alternative, though. So you're in the prison system. What if there are prisoners who are difficult to manage for whatever reason? Mentally ill, for example. They're potentially they're violent, or they'll potentially self-injure. What do you do with them? What are the other options?
Sure. Well, there are many other options, and it's interesting because difficult to manage inmates are not new. The growth in segregation is relatively new, and there are many jurisdictions around the world that are actually reversing the trend in terms of the use of segregation. So there are alternatives.
Like what? I mean, I remember post Ashley Smith, there was all sorts of recommendations.
Sure.
Has the government responded to them? What are these things?
I was going to say, when it comes to mentally ill offenders, for example, these same offenders whose behavior is very problematic in a prison cell is much better managed medically. And so we've made a series of recommendations about screening, assessment, and transfer, and utilizing exchange of service agreements with provincial hospitals, forensic centers that specialize in the care and treatment of these kind of ill individuals.
Do we have the capacity to do that? But some people say our prisons have become places where we're handling mental illness. They're not equipped to do so.
Well, sure. Prisons aren't hospitals, but these people are patients. And so the idea is to transfer them into the appropriate resource. And those resources exist. And so there are negotiations underway between the Correctional Service of Canada and provincial authorities, but those negotiations have been underway for years.
Mr. Sapers, is there any connection between any of the legislation in the last number of years that the government has passed regarding prisons and the so-called tough on crime agenda and the use of segregation or the construct of the population?
Well, there's two things that may have an impact on the use of segregation. One is the overall capacity issues. We know that the cumulative impact of the legislative agenda that's unfolded over the last half dozen years has been more people being sent to prison and spending longer sentences. So that is a strain on capacity. You've got more people serving a sentence. That's just going to challenge the correctional service just in terms of the physical capacity to manage sentences. But there's also been some language change and some policy change around how sentences are administered. So, for example, the law requires segregation to be used minimally. The principle is known as least restrictive, but that language of least restrictive option was actually taken out of the Corrections and Conditional Release Act and replaced with other language which provides much less guidance to the correctional authority on how they're to manage a sentence.
And so segregation may be a result of that. Before I let you go today, you're going to be leaving this position after 10 years as the prison ombudsman. You've been on this program a lot. Often, you've had to heap a fair bit of criticism on the government, on Correctional Services Canada. You wanted to stay in this job, I understand. Can you tell me, do you feel you're not being renewed because of your critiques? What's your sense of that?
Look, it's an ombudsman's job to comment on maladministration. When a complaint is investigated and we find that it's the result of an improper, illegal, unfair application of a law or a policy, we comment on it, we make recommendations to change it. We also look at systemic issues and we provide recommendations on how to make the system work the way it was designed to work. That is the role of an ombudsman. I've never been told that I shouldn't be doing that, and in fact that's the way that I've operated in the office for over a decade now. Nobody has come to me and said, we want you gone because you're making too much noise.
But you don't want to be gone, is that fair?
It's always the government's prerogative to make these order and council appointments. They feel it's time for a change in the office after 11 years.
Right.
And
you would have happily stayed, but they think it's time for a change.
That's right.
All right. Well, you're still here. There's a transition period, I know. Mr. Sapers, a very interesting study today. We will have you back on the program before you leave. Thanks, sir. By the way, we just received a statement from the Office of the Minister in charge of the prison system, Public Safety Minister Stephen Blaney. Here's what he has just sent us. Quote, administrative segregation is an accepted practice widely used in other Western countries. Canadians expect violent criminals to serve sentences which reflect the severity of their crimes. We continue supporting victims and punishing criminals. Not an answer necessarily about why so many mentally ill or women and Aboriginals or black inmates are disproportionately involved in segregation, but nonetheless that's the response from the Minister of Public Safety.